This is part two of a conversation with Mayor Steve Rideout. We're just delighted to have you come back because we did spend a lot of time on the special election issues. It's good to get those understood, and I thought you did a great job last week explaining where we are and where the city is. But there are a lot of other things that are going on. Let me just start with something that I've been watching with interest, and that is land banking. I do feel like this is a possible solution for places like Cambridge, and I'd like to get an idea of where the council is and where you are on whether it works and whether we should be doing more of it.
The concept of land banking is, it's many years old, and they do it out in the Midwest much more than here. Someone who used to work for the county council. Anyway, she started trying to do something to speed up what we were doing in terms of tax sales and whatnot for property that the city or the county received. And as a result of that, eventually the legislature looked at land banking, which is allowing communities to bring together various parts of real estate in a jurisdiction, whether it's the city or the county, in order to more effectively address the concerns about dilapidated housing, landlords who are out of control in terms of how they're dealing with their tenants, finding better available space in the city, for instance, Cambridge, for building a larger building, an apartment building, or a development that would accommodate homeless, or in any number of different things. On top of that, what happened was, actually, when I was on council, DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, allowed us to hire Yvette Robinson, who is from Detroit, but comes here for a week a month to help us with the Pine Street area, because there was such a challenge in that area of dilapidated housing, housing that was just falling apart, housing that we really needed to preserve because it's important. It's an important area of the city, and she is knowledgeable likewise about that. So I'm giving you a very long answer to what this housing is all about. But she found two legislators from Michigan who had dealt with it in their legislature, and they were now out of the legislature but doing consulting work, and so brought them here to listen to what we were trying to accomplish. The city council, before I went on as mayor, had already set aside $1 million for land banking to buy property that we could then piece together, that sort of thing. So what is now happening is the consultants have put together, and we haven't seen it yet, but what some legislation could look like. And it's not only about land banking, but it's also about code enforcement, and it's how to help ensure that landlords are protected with their property, but also that they maintain their property, and that tenants are protected as tenants so that they can't be run over roughshod by landlords. So we have to be sure that there's a balance there in terms of what the how we deal with this issue. We just can't just sort of go, okay, we're going to landlords, if you're not good with your property, we're going to take it away from you. It's more about, we're going to give you an opportunity to fix your property up. If you fail to do that, there'll be consequences, fines or whatever, but ultimately, if you're not going to fix it up, that property could come to the land bank or could go to the tenant if the tenant wanted to be able to fix the property up. Also, as part of the legislation that they're proposing, if the tenant was having a problem with the landlord and couldn't get the property fixed, the tenant could stop paying the rent. And under current Maryland law, you could send it to the court, but also the idea would be you could set it aside in the land bank and then collect enough that the tenant could then fix the property up. So the land bank is more about looking at how you improve the value of real estate housing in your community so that people can live in decent housing, so landlords can get a fair rental, but that they have to maintain property. Part of the problem with the housing in Cambridge has been that we have moved from a majority homeownership to a majority rental. And in addition, our code that deals with how we check on landlords and the quality of the housing and whether it's being maintained has really fallen to the wayside. We also haven't hired enough people to do the work to see that the houses are actually maintained. And so the real issue now would be, I think, getting into the houses. Right now, we don't have the authority to do that. But again, looking at new code enforcement legislation, that would certainly be part of the solution.
So how much of the $1 million have you used?
It is probably, I know we bought a couple of properties. I would say probably 200,000 at the outside. There were some properties down on near Pine Street or on Pine Street, and then we just bought a piece of property out on Washington Street near the Public Works. I know we're going to be buying or paying off a tax lien on a property right next to the zip mark there on Glasgow. So it's in the area of 200,000. I think that has been spent. But I think the idea is that we would put more money into that potentially. For instance, we're going after a $4 million grant for housing issues with HUD. That money would ostensibly go into that fund, opportunity fund, so that we could then use it to improve housing here in town.
How fast is this process supposed to work? Like these properties that you've already bought, I don't know how many properties $200,000 buys you, but does the city move in immediately and stabilize these properties in some sense, or do they just continue looking like slum property?
Well, the properties so far have all been without real estate on them.
You mean no structure on them?
There's no structure. I mean, houses, condos, apartments, whatever. But ostensibly, it could be that we would buy a piece of real estate that had a dilapidated house and then turn around and tear the house down, or look to, with the money in the land bank, to fix up the house so that it could then be given, sold, rented to someone.
And what specific legislative authority do you need?
Well, there's state authority already, and then we have to pass local legislation that fits with what the state will allow us to do. I have not looked at that legislation to know what the details are, but we have to comply with state mandates in order to make this work. And I think we are one of the first, if not the first, community that's starting a land bank.
Somewhat related to this is the enforcement of code.
Yes.
And I did want to get a sense of how the city plans to move forward and actually enforcing what these properties need to do.
Well, the current code has its deficiencies, and the process over the last few years, because of COVID, had some significant complications because of the need sometimes to go to court to get fines or consequences for landlords because they hadn't fixed up property, but then The other part of the problem is, what if the landlords don't pay the fines? What do you do? And do you then have to go back through another expensive legal process to foreclose on the property that because they didn't pay the fine? And do the banks owe money on the property? And I mean, there's all sorts of complexity to it. So what is happening is the city manager has gotten some part-time staff to look into several different issues, and one of them is code enforcement. I think it's Cheryl Hanna who is working on the code enforcement issue, and she's looking at what other cities do, what legislation they have that will make the system work better, and eventually what will be coming back to us would be a decision that, oh, this is the best legislation, so let's bring it in, or let's write some new legislation. But the idea would be to be not only fair to the landlords, but also to the tenants in this whole process.
Is there any thought being given to raising the penalties or the fees? Because I've heard that for some landlords, the penalties they pay are just part of the cost of doing business for them.
Well, there are several ideas that have been thrown out, one of which is, for instance, if it's a vacant house, vacant houses would pay a higher tax rate than another house, the ones that are obviously occupied. It might be that if a landlord has had an internal inspection of his 5 properties or her 5 properties, and they're good, then they'll be waived. Further inspections will be waived for 2 or 3 or 5 years because they have shown that they're good landlords. Or there could be, if you have a landlord who fails to maintain the property, they may not be given a license to rent that property the next time. One of the challenges here, and it was raised during the mayoral election, is many of the properties owned by landlords are owned by LLCs. And
limited liability corporations.
Yeah, and they have not only limited liability, their only asset is that property. And so they can buy that property at a tax sale for $2,000, $5,000, $20,000, whatever. They can put, $15,000, $20,000 into that property to make it rentable, and then they can just rent the heck out of it and not maintain it and not pay the taxes. And they can pull all that money.
Not pay the taxes?
Sure.
How do they escape liability for taxation? I don't.
Well, you don't pay the taxes, and then you get called, in for a tax sale, and then you may pay the taxes, or you may not pay the taxes, and it depends on where you are in the how well the property is doing. I mean, if it's really running well and you're making lots of money, then you'll pay the taxes. If it's not running well, or if you rented it for 10 years and the property is now fallen into disrepair, you may go, it's just not worth paying the taxes anymore, so I'm just going to walk away from the property.